Very welcome to our PlaNat webinar, From Field to Forest, Why People Choose Natural Colonization for Woodland Expansion. Some of you may have been part of our webinar series before, and others may be new. The TreePlanet project is a UKRI funded research project that's been going for about 2 years, where we try to understand how and where and for whom natural colonization can be a good strategy for woodland expansion. And we've had a very extensive ecological component to the project, but also a very important social science component. And today, Bianca and Rachel will be presenting about the findings, the outcomes from their social science work. So I think there'll be about half an hour, 45 minutes of presentations, following by a Q&A. And we are recording this, so just want to let you know that if you do share things in the chat, or if you do end up turning on a video, if that's possible, I'm not sure it is, that you may be recorded on YouTube at some point. But on that note, I'm very pleased to hand over to Rachel and Bianca, and I look forward to hearing what they have to say.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to kick us off. I'm going to hopefully get a slide deck up now. Okay, it doesn't want me to use that button. It wants me to use this button. Okay, please bear with me for a second. I need to put it onto slideshow. How do I do this here? I can't see an active slideshow. Sorry, everybody. I can't see how to make that into an active slideshow. There we go. There we go. So hopefully everyone can see that clearly. So thanks very much, Mark, for the introduction. Yes, so what we'd like to talk to you about today is research from TreePlanet and also some other complementary research projects to give you a big picture of why land managers might use natural colonisation. So we're really answering 3 key questions in this presentation. They were the key questions that cut across the research that we've been doing. So first of all, what kinds of perceptions do land managers have around the benefits and the risks and the challenges associated with natural colonisation? So I'll delve into that in a little bit of depth in a moment. And then really importantly, what kind of trade-offs are land managers making when they're deciding to use whichever woodland expansion approach they're considering? So Rachel will dive into that into more detail. And then when we're thinking about the uptake of natural colonisation as a woodland expansion strategy, what things might actually encourage people to think about natural colonisation as an option? And Rachel and I will split that question between us. So just by way of introduction, I just think it's really important to outline what we mean by natural colonisation. So if you've not been to one of these seminars before, you may not have had the definitions presented to you. So what we're talking about in this project, when we're thinking about natural colonisation, it's an approach to woodland cover that's illustrated at the bottom of this diagram. So what we're talking about is a passive process where woodland is established through natural processes, and that's on land which hasn't been wooded for a while. So that's quite different to tree planting, which is an active approach shown at the top of this diagram. And what we're going to talk a little bit about further on in this presentation, hybrid approaches which sit in between. So I won't dwell on that now, but just keep that natural colonisation definition in mind and realise that there's somewhere in between tree planting and that approach. Also, just a quick word that we're going to show you the TreePlanet project data, but we have 2 other complementary projects that have been running alongside TreePlanet. So just to make the point that they ran at different times, so we're going to show you research results that go from 2021 through to 2024, and TreePlanet will finish, and our other piece of research will finish in 2025. And I think what's really important to take away from this slide as well is that we've spoken to over 750 land managers and advisors. So we're thinking that the results that we're going to show you now are pretty good results that represent quite a large section of the woodland forestry community out there. So just to delve into that first question then, what perceptions are there amongst land managers about the benefits and risks associated with natural colonisation? So in that first social science project that we had that came before PlaNat, we spoke to over 67 land managers and conducted some in-depth interviews with them. And we looked at that qualitative data and coded it up. And as we coded it up, what we found was that depending on the land manager's objectives and depending on their understanding and approach to natural colonisation, what you could see were three what we call different identity types that came through who understood the benefits and the risks of natural colonisation in different ways. So looking at this table, you can see that the three identities, we've got them in different colours here. So one is what we call conservation identities. The one in the middle there is sort of public or amenity type identities. And the third that we identified were the sort of productive identities. And you have different kinds of land managers clustered in each of those identity types. So those different identities emphasise the benefits and the risks in different ways. So if we're looking at the conservation identity land managers, they were really interested in the benefits around expanding and connecting existing woodlands. That's what they thought natural colonisation could offer them. They really emphasised how natural colonisation was likely to give them good biodiversity returns, naturalness and resilience to changing climate scenarios and risk of pests and diseases coming in. They also emphasised that the carbon costs of tree planting were quite high as far as they were concerned, and so therefore natural colonisation presented an opportunity to lower those carbon costs around establishing woodland. In terms of the risks, those are outlined here in italic. So conservation identities really were not quite certain what natural colonisation might give them. So even if they thought that biodiversity was likely to be encouraged and be quite high, whether or not that biodiversity would come was an uncertainty, so was a risk. And also the costs of establishing natural colonisation and being able to monitor that natural colonisation and understanding what was going on was a risk. And when we think about the cost of establishment here, we're thinking around, things like protection from deer and so on, so that your establishment actually gets off on a good footing and isn't being predated by mammals and other factors. If we look at the identities that we called public or amenity, the benefits that they saw with natural colonisation were naturalness. So rather than having trees in rows, you'd have a natural scatter of trees through the landscape, which would just pull up the aesthetics for those people who might be interested in the woodlands that they owned. They recognised that there were many sites where the suitability for natural colonisation as an establishment process might be better than tree planting. So, for example, difficult sites. And they too were also interested in carbon budgets. Again, as the conservation identities identified, these people also thought that tree planting presented a cost in terms of carbon budgets and natural colonisation was better. In terms of the risks that they were thinking about, because they're providing amenity woodlands or woodlands with public access, they were rather worried about public perception of natural colonisation. Would it be seen as messy, untidy, the fact that land had been abandoned and wasn't really being looked after properly? So there's something reassuring in a bunch of tree tubes. It looks like somebody's doing something around tree planting and land management, whereas natural colonisation doesn't really indicate that it's happening because it goes over time. So that was a concern for them. Looking at those who had a more productive approach to land management, they could see benefits around site suitability. So, for example, where they had very poor areas of land, perhaps things were a bit too wet for active agriculture, say, they could see that natural colonisation could actually be of a benefit there. They recognised resilience. So again, natural colonisation bringing resilience to climate change, local pests and diseases. They saw that there was a low cost to establishment compared to tree planting. But for them, the major risk was, again, this outcome uncertainty. What were they going to get, when, and how far would the outcome actually fit in with their overall objectives? So if we look at the data slightly differently, so that the slides I've just shown you pulled out the relative value and importance of the different risks and benefits. We looked at the data slightly differently, and what this diagram is illustrating is when we asked what kinds of approaches people preferred, that sort of cut across those identities in a way, and we've got a large cluster of land managers. So they're represented here by C6 and C4 in this branching diagram. So that's about 65% of the respondents. They said that they saw value, so benefits, with tree planting and natural colonisation. Both of them were important. They didn't want to say that one approach was more important than another approach. If you look across to the right-hand side of this diagram, so C1 and C2, which represent about 10% of our respondents, they said that they would prefer more natural processes and they were more positive overall towards natural colonisation. And then if you look to the far left of this diagram, so cluster C5 and C3 here, this represents about 25% of the respondents. They said that they thought that tree planting was perhaps the more positive approach. So I think that's a really interesting pattern. So it's not that we've got large people who are really for natural colonisation or large numbers of people who are really for tree planting. The largest number of people see that there's value in both. So what we then did with the Tree PlaNat project is dive into that to have a look at a bit more detail. So what's going on with that large group in the middle? So this is the results from the Tree PlaNat National Survey. And what we can see here, that large segment in the purple is repeating what we found in the qualitative data. So in this survey, 72% of 542 respondents said that they thought tree planting and natural colonisation, and indeed the hybrid approaches in between, were all important approaches to tree cover. We've got a smaller percentage saying that natural colonisation is a better approach, so just 3%, the blue segment here. A smaller percentage compared to the qualitative data saying that tree planting is the better approach, just 9% here. But we've got an important 16% who are now saying that hybrid approaches are really important. So we didn't pick that up in the qualitative data, but we've picked that up in the Tree PlaNat survey data. So that's really important. So those hybrid approaches that combine planting and natural processes turn out to be very significant. And if we just delve into that in a little bit more detail. So what I'm showing you here on the left-hand side is that diagram that we used for definitions at the beginning. So the hybrid approaches here are those two middle rows. So we're talking about combining natural colonisation with different forms of planting. So it could be low density planting, so that's the second row, or it could be what ecologists call applied nucleation, which is planting small groups of small clumps of trees. So that speeds up the process. So it addresses some of the risks and concerns that land managers had about outcome certainty and about length of time to see some results. So what I'm trying to show with the two diagrams, if you look at the headings at the top, is that when we looked to see what land managers meant by hybridity, so that's 16% in the Tree PlaNat survey, they recognised spatially mixed hybridity, so that's what we're showing in the diagram on the left. But interestingly, they also talked about hybridity in terms of being spatially distinct. So that's the right-hand diagram, which is trying to show you that that spatially distinct is mixing natural processes and tree planting across the same land holding. So in the diagram on the right-hand side, natural colonisation might be indicated by the sort of shaded in yellow areas, and tree planting by the blue shaded in areas. So you're mixing the approaches not intimately, but across a land holding. And the natural colonisation might be used there for difficult places and the tree planting in more optimum places.
Thank you, Bianca. So moving on to the next key question, we were looking to dive a little more into the depth of what are the different trade-offs that land managers are perceiving when they're deciding which of these 3 woodland expansion approaches to use on their land holding. So using this national survey of land managers, we asked them 17 quantitative questions, which were using a slider so that they could choose any mix of the different approaches. So rather than just having tree planting or natural colonisation, giving them the opportunity to have any mix in the middle of the 2. And then we built on the land manager identities of the conservation, public amenity, and productive as a way to have a purposive quota sampling, so that we were making sure that we were covering land managers with a variety of different objectives for their land. And the survey was open this time last year, so over winter 23 to 24. And we also were keen to get a spread across Great Britain. So it was mostly England, but we had a good representation of Scotland and a few from Wales as well. So in terms of what we were asking them, for each of the possible objectives of their land, we asked which woodland expansion approach they would choose to use. So, for example, if they were thinking particularly about the well-being of themselves, what would they choose to use? And here we can see the analysis, which maybe looks a little complicated, but the essence of it is that the closer to 0 in the centre is the land manager choosing tree planting, and then the closer it is to number 5 is only natural colonisation. So around the 2.5 is choosing about 50-50 hybrid approaches. And as you can see, what's really interesting here is that the pattern seems to be the same depending on what the objective is, but not depending on whether the land manager identifies as sort of productive, conservation, or public amenity. And then just finally, we're carrying on the analysis to look a little bit more into the degrees of difference behind that. And that then brings us on to this table that we generated from the first project to give an overview of how these different objectives are seen, and like which woodland expansion approach was seen as either appropriate or not to meet these different objectives. And then the idea is that once we've completed the analysis of the national survey, we'll be able to replace the smiley faces with numbers to give us more detail. And so, having asked over 500 land managers their views, we then carried out 35 interviews as follow-on interviews to validate the findings of the survey. So as you can see on the left here, we have the 3 options of woodland expansion approaches we were asking about. And then in the middle, we have the key findings from the survey results. So we found that in terms of tree planting, that was seen as being the most appropriate method for stand density and species mixture. And then we went to land managers from across Scotland, England and Wales, and particularly tried to get greater representation from Wales and Scotland, to ask them why they thought the land managers in general had chosen this approach. So, for example, with resilience, it was a case that many of them felt that having a hybrid approach gave you the opportunity to have a broader array of species, and that builds resilience. And then in terms of biodiversity, we also could understand a little bit more of the nuance behind people's answers. And so, for example, people were maybe choosing hybrid because they weren't sure whether at first you'd have less biodiversity with natural colonisation, and this also highlighted some of the uncertainties around different approaches. And then in terms of examples of where we can see these objectives being the key reason behind their choices. The interviews were really useful for giving us that in-depth information. So, for example, with difficult land to work, explanations of what is meant by that term of difficult land to work. So whether it's craggy and inaccessible or it's very wet and boggy. Seems to have frozen for me. Are you able to move it on, Bianca?
No, because the option for me to take control of the slide seems to have disappeared.
Ah, that's always helpful when technology's on side.
Yeah, so if you go towards the page number, to the, hang on. You go towards the page number, Rachel, can you see the little arrows there? That's it, you've got it now, I think.
There we go. Sorry about that. And so we also asked the interviewees why they thought all approaches were seen as being important, and what really came through was being able to be flexible and have that site-specific choice, and not even site-specific on a landholding scale, but also on a really quite localized choosing which parts of their landholding is suitable for different methods. It was really interesting, their views on whether natural colonisation would meet public approval, because in the survey we found that was actually quite split in terms of whether land managers felt that the public would be on board. And it seems to connect quite closely with the rewilding debate, and as to whether or not the public are on board with rewilding, and whether they perceive areas of natural colonisation as being part of that movement, or whether, as Bianca already mentioned, they feel that it looks scrappy and messy and perhaps more like land abandonment. We also used the survey to gather more information on what information was lacking for land managers. So what exactly it is that they need to understand more about natural colonisation and hybrid approaches. And the interviews gave us an opportunity to continue that conversation and understand what exactly the land managers are requiring. And so using the interview data, we had a bachelor's student from the University of Edinburgh carry out a values analysis of the interview data. And so they found that it was interesting how the value of the land manager influenced their choice of the woodland approach. So we can see here that in the interviews of only 35 land managers, they found that generally a lot of them had a high utilitarian, moralistic and naturalistic values behind their choices. But when it comes to natural colonisation, they actually tended to sometimes have a bit more of a negativistic value behind their choice of approach. I will pass over to Bianca.
But Rachel, would you be able to move the slides on for me, because I've lost that function? Sure. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so having a look now at what might encourage people to choose natural colonisation, what can be done to overcome some of the barriers to their perception of risk, etc. I think regardless of which project data set you look at, the TreE PlaNat data set certainly emphasises these three key areas. So the first is about knowledge and information. So knowledge and information that helps to overcome that outcome uncertainty gap, and also knowledge and information in terms of peer group connection. So being able to understand how peers might have used natural colonisation, what they feel about it, and so on. There's something very important about language and the way in which natural colonisation is presented. So I think Rachel's already hinted at that. That's partly around whether or not the language resonates with values and objectives. So if natural colonisation is seen as rewilding, for example, or presented as rewilding, that may make a difference. And language and presentation that brings people's awareness of the approach, the recognition of the approach, is important. And then the final one here overall is thinking about financial support. And that's not only about pounds and pence, that's also about what we might call economic pertinence. So sort of the balance of costs and benefits and finance all looked at together. So for the amount of money you might be losing putting your land into natural colonisation, or the amount of money it costs, the amount of money you might get in grant support, does all of that balance out with the realisation of your objectives around those benefits? So if we look at some of those in a little bit of detail now. So just having a look from the TreE PlaNat survey, if we look at this chart, what this is really showing us is whether or not people have confidence in applying different tree cover expansion approaches. And the general takeaway from this slide is that people are pretty comfortable with tree planting, so that's the blue bar at the bottom. But when you look at natural colonisation and hybrid approaches, it's not that they're not comfortable. There is a percentage, 50 to 60% for both of those approaches, that feel that they have some kind of confidence, but there's an equally large number who do not feel confident. So if you move on to the next one, Rachel. So digging into those knowledge needs and how they feed into confidence. So looking at the three approaches there, so again, drawing on the TreE PlaNat survey, unpicking that pattern that we saw on the bar chart. Around tree planting, I'm sure you'll recognise that there's a general call for a bit more practical advice, not only about tree planting and tree establishment, but that longer term care and management that leads to successful establishment. There's a need here for understanding more about species resilience to future climate impacts. So I think you might be familiar with that, species diversity, how to get the right species planted out, and how to integrate tree planting with different kinds of land management objectives seemed to be another need that came through from the TreE PlaNat survey. And if we contrast that then with what land managers were telling us about natural colonisation and hybrid approaches, I've put the two together because the results were indicating that their knowledge needs were rather the same. So first and foremost was, targeted practical information about how to successfully implement natural colonisation was being asked for, particularly around some of the issues that might affect that outcome certainty or uncertainty, so deer management, for example, and other land management techniques that you might employ to make sure that natural colonisation or hybridity actually worked. There was a general call for more information about how natural colonisation might meet long-term sustainability needs and climate resilience and biodiversity. So even though we saw from some of that data early on that people perceived that natural colonisation would be good for these things, they wanted to know more about whether or not their perceptions were actually reality as far as ecological science could tell them, or as far as their peers or advisors could tell them. And then they wanted real world examples and expert advice to help them navigate the complexity of natural colonisation, getting it established, and of employing hybrid approaches. So next slide, please, Rachel. So just delving into the detail of all of that, those knowledge gaps for natural colonisation specifically here, this is the detail of what they were really interested in under those broader headings. And you can see the relative importance of the different subjects to the respondents in the survey. So timescales and establishment, really important. Deer and pest control, really important. Management techniques for enabling natural colonisation to establish well, really important. And that thought about, the outcome profiles. What can you tell me about what I'm likely to get if I use natural colonisation? So that's the key messages there. Next one, please, Rachel. So now looking at the language and presentation. So what came through from the early work that we did was that some words can really encourage land manager interest and other words are really not very appealing at all. So what I've chosen to show you here are some bar charts that show negative and positive responses to different terms by land managers under those different identity types. So if we have a look at the productive identity types on the left-hand side here, you can see a big red bar, so indicating quite a negative response to the word rewilding. It kind of goes against the sort of fundamental values and objectives that they have. So rewilding, not a good term to use if you want to bring those people on board, but equally natural colonisation, seen as negative. Negative because it's not well understood, it's not well recognised, the awareness of what it actually means isn't really there within this community, and colonisation itself is not necessarily a very positive word. Colonising whom and for what purpose? A bit of suspicion there. You can see a slightly different pattern on the right-hand side with the conservation identities, where natural colonisation really not liked at all. Very high red bar there. Rewilding also not particularly popular, but natural regeneration a sort of clear favourite. And down the bottom, amongst the public amenity utility identities, natural regeneration standing tall and proud as a positive word, with the other two that we were testing at that time coming up as negative. So, you know, the key messages from that are, if you are wanting to raise awareness and let people know what natural colonisation has to offer, and indeed what any of the approaches to woodland expansion have to offer, choose your words carefully, because if you start talking about rewilding or scrub or some of these other terms that might be applied, you may be turning off a potential audience who won't start on the journey towards considering that approach as a feasible option for them. Next slide, please. We also asked advisors their view on the different terms. This data comes from the Forestry Commission UCO team, who did this as an exercise when they met together in August last year, and looking at the words that they are familiar with and the words that they think have the best purchase amongst land managers. You can see by far and away the largest bar right down there at the bottom is the bar that indicates that natural regeneration might be the best term to use. Problematic from an ecological point of view, because natural regeneration for forest ecologists is really about trees regenerating in an area which is currently woodland or was woodland in the recent past. So not quite what we understand in terms of the definitions that I presented at the beginning. But in terms of overall recognition and terminology that people are comfortable with, and what they think that natural colonisation is, what they think of something that is positive language, natural regeneration coming through there quite strongly. Next one, please, Rachel. Over to you.
Thank you. So we also looked at the financial support that's available for land managers, and this was just looking at England. And after a search and speaking to lots of knowledgeable people in this area, we found 7 grant offers with natural colonisation as an option. But it was interesting because there was a clear distinction between the objectives of these grants. So 4 of them were with woodland expansion in mind, whereas 3 of those grant offers were more for scrub or successional habitats with an aim to overall nature recovery. So as you can see from the support map on the right-hand side, which maps all of those 7 grant offers, it's a pretty complicated grant landscape because it can vary a lot depending on geographically where you are in the country as to what grant offers are available to you. And so this means that it's complicated for land managers to find out what they are eligible to apply for, but it's also complicated for advisors to navigate and keep on top of what is the current grant landscape and what they should be advising on. And so we reached out to the 4 grant offers that have woodland expansion as their objective and gathered data from them on the uptake of those grant offers. And we found that a small proportion of those of their overall grant offering is using this natural colonisation, and it's often as a small area within a larger planting scheme. So going back to that spatially distinct hybridity, so people are applying to do a large planting scheme and then they'll just have an area which has natural colonisation. And so looking to how we could, if policy is keen to increase the uptake of natural colonisation grants. We carried out 3 focus groups and a validation workshop with both land managers and advisors to understand their knowledge and awareness, but also sort of really understand their needs if they're going to apply for a grant offer for natural colonisation. And it's really clear how important the communication is. So linking back to that language and presentation. So how natural colonisation is presented to land managers, and also how it is explained as an approach that can meet their objectives. And this also links to how the grant offers need to really clearly explain how hybridity is available as part of their offer, and how flexible their offer can be in terms of using natural colonisation as part of their agreement. And then in terms of the complicated landscape for grants, it's really important to improve the signposting for grant offers. So whether that's signposting between the grant offers, which is already happening in some cases, but also making it really clear what are the objectives of the different grant offers, and what are the pros and cons of choosing that one. And in particular, this needs to be signposted to the advisors, so they know how to best advise the land managers. And then flexibility kept coming up as a recurring theme, and the need for sort of site-specific support. So rather than a one-size-fits-all, having the funding organisation have the capacity to be able to really tailor the agreement to the land manager and their site, and also build the trust between them that they and are included in the decision making on how these different woodland approaches are used on their land. So for more information on all of these projects, we've got 2 websites. So on the left-hand side, there's a QR code which will take you to the Forest Research website. And in 2025, there will be more reports and outputs coming out then. And then on the right hand side, there's a QR code that will take you to the PlaNat website, which is where you will be able to find the recording of this webinar, as well as all the past webinars, and also all the outputs from that project, which is also wrapping up in 2025. And it's also just worth highlighting that, of course, Bianca and I are working on both, well, all of these projects, and we are very keen to collaborate. And therefore, we're going to be putting together a collaborative research briefing, which will draw together the narrative from all these different strands of research to hopefully be as accessible as possible to everyone. And then we'd just like to thank our partners. So the first line is all the partners in the TreE PlaNat project, and on the bottom line are our key contributors, and we really couldn't have done the research without them, and also the funders. Thank you. And I think we're now ready to take any questions.
I need to stop sharing. I can't manage to do that.
Oh, I might be able to.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bianca and Rachel. I think I've just managed to change the settings so that everyone can turn on their camera if they feel comfortable with doing that, and also unmute to ask questions in the Q&A. But if you don't want to unmute and ask your own questions, you can also write them in the chat. So we have about 20 minutes or slightly under for some questions to Rachel and Bianca. So who would like to kick off? Or maybe whilst we're waiting for people to think of questions, I'll start with one. Having been part of the project for a while and sort of seeing the results drip in, and also through our sort of parallel knowledge user board where we've been having ongoing conversations with land managers, it's really nice to see how you've pulled everything together, but all the results make a lot of sense to me. I was wondering for you guys whether there were any surprises that have come up in working on this project or this topic over the last year or couple of years.
Any surprises for you, Bianca?
Any surprises?
Hmm.
I think the hybridity, really, the fact that that came out as so important for so many reasons. So the flexibility that it offers and the way that it can overcome some of the risks. And then if we talk to our ecological colleagues, they're also very excited about hybridity because you can see that you can speed up the rate of change, that perhaps you can get enhanced biodiversity. So it's an area that both scientists and land managers seem to be really interested in. So I think that was the most surprising thing.
And it was also something that came up in the knowledge user board conversations that we've had, sort of with a set group of individuals. Some of you on the call probably have been with us throughout the journey, and it has been something that has come up there, but it's really great to see that reflected in the overall survey results as well. We have a question from Mark. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, it might be a bit of a technical one, but we're looking at natural colonisation, but we're realising, is it a total ban on influencing it? We're wondering actually seed gathering for the first 8 years from some of those trees to actually then, if we have to restock at the end of the 8 years, then we've got stuff in already. And are we allowed to do things like scraping thatch away on the grass to encourage a raw seed bed? Is that your sort of field, or is that too technical?
So I think, Rachel, you should answer that question because you've got a better idea of the grant conditionalities.
That was going to be my question back to you. Is this in terms of, are you able to do it to meet grant conditions, or are you able to do it as in, is there ecological basis as to whether that works? Because in terms of the grant conditionalities, I'm aware that that some of them have quite a limited list of sort of ground preparation techniques that are permitted and funded, but some of the grant offers are very open and open to a discussion on what's most suitable for the site and allocating funding accordingly.
I think we are looking at the grant process. I think, we mainly work with volunteers, so it naturally lends itself if we didn't need to plant, obviously, and it gives us the cost in terms of deer protection if we decide to go down the fencing route. So, okay, well, I'll hunt out the different systems between UCO and, because I'm in Northumberland, we have Great Northumberland Forest as one as well. So yeah. But it's I'm just mulling it over because it's right next to an ancient woodland, so we're really excited about the continuation side of that onto the old pasture. But thanks for that. That really helps.
And Miles, you're next.
Thanks. We've mentioned a few times in there that uncertainty of outcome, and that applies to a couple of different cohorts as well. Similar to the previous question, do you think that is a direct response to the grant condition and sort of the response and sort of fear of that grant condition, or is that a land manager's concern over sort of reaching their objectives, do you think?
I think we've probably got two different perspectives, haven't we? You go first, Rachel, and then I'll see what you say. I might add something.
Well, I was just going to point out that, so from that very first project where they spoke to over 80 land managers, only 3% of those land managers that were carrying out natural colonisation were using a grant. So I think, and that then came through quite strongly when doing research specifically into grants, is that quite a few land managers are maybe happy to use it as an approach, but not so interested in maybe using a grant for it because of fear of conditionalities. But I think this is also really strongly related to the fact that the grant offers are all quite young. So 3 of those 4 grant offers were set up in 2021, and we've very much been doing this research in conversation with the funding organisation so they can adapt and update their grant offers as we produce results on and give the feedback from land managers. So it's very much an evolving process in terms of the appetite, but obviously the tricky part is then of course, land managers and advisors' knowledge of what that grant entails has to continually update every time there's an update. So yeah, that sort of communication is quite key around what those conditionalities are and whether there is clawback. But we were actually a little bit surprised that clawback in terms of needing to pay back a grant offer for not meeting a condition wasn't generally perceived as a fear or a reason not to take up a grant by those who had already used a grant. Bianca, would you like to add anything?
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. So taking it away from the grants again and going back to the first point that you made, that people may not be using grants at all, but they're still thinking about the outcome and uncertainty. So we had quite a lot of really choice quotes within the qualitative data. So will I get the right kind of woodland? Will I get the right kind of biodiversity? Things along those lines. So yeah, very much, regardless of whether it was more productive or more conservation oriented, very much will I get what it is I'm looking for? And what do I do if I don't get what it is I'm looking for? So the biggest fear was to get a blanket of all one species, birch or willow, for example, that have probably more negative connotations amongst land managers as being invasive and not really useful for anything.
Thanks, that's really handy. Thank you.
Great. And then we have a question from Alexander.
Hello. Sorry, 2 seconds. Hello. First of all, thank you. I think it's been really informative, especially the part about the language and what can almost put landowners off looking at natural colonisation as a form of woodland creation or expansion. I, as a woodland creation, I can deliver things like trees for climates, natural regeneration grants to cover sort of the costs that come with it. But with an organisation such as myself and a lot of local authorities and stuff, all of our environmental targets are towards trees planted. So our target is 250,000 of trees. And I think we've got 2 years left to do it. And I know a lot of other organisations with environmental and sustainability targets go towards the trees planted or stems per hectare, etc. And I didn't know if forestry research had any experience incorporating obviously I understand the importance of natural regen, but somebody that's perhaps doesn't, incorporating that into targets going forward, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And that's something I've had conversations with the funding organisations about, is asking them whether they have targets for the natural colonisation aspect. And one of them did, and another one mentioned how they already incorporate the sort of anticipated stems per hectare into their targets. So because each of the grants has a requirement for the number of stems per hectare that the site would need to meet by, normally it's year 10. And normally if it hasn't reached that or is on track for reaching that by year 5, then you include some supplementary planting to make sure that you're definitely meeting that grant condition. And so the funding organisations tended to be already including that anticipated stems per hectare as contributing towards meeting their tree planting targets, even though it's not planting necessarily.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Is there any chance that, I don't know whether you could share sort of the way that they've gone about it and approached it? Would that be something that you're able to share? Yeah, well, so it seems to be being treated slightly differently by each of the different funding organisations. So the one I just mentioned about the already incorporating the stems per hectare, that was the community forests are already including their natural colonisation areas as part of their sort of woodland created. And then the Northern Forest, which is a collaboration of the Woodland Trust and several other partners, they have specific natural processes, targets that they're aiming to meet, so they keep it distinct. Yeah, because I work with Humber Forest, which is part of the Northern Forest, and they assess the success of a site through canopy cover. Obviously, canopy cover through a natural regen site might take longer than when you're already planting whips that are a few years old or standard trees that are even older. Okay, Brill, thank you. I'll shut up. That's been really helpful. Thank you.
I think that raised some really important issues, because I wonder also, Alexander, whether that might also be one of the reasons why we see these small areas of natural colonisation within larger schemes. And talking about success there, that's something that we've debated quite hard, isn't it, Rachel, with funders and others? What does successful natural colonisation look like? That's really, really elusive. And how does that sit in a landscape down here in England, where you're looking at BNG? How do all those things fit together? So some really interesting questions raised there, Alexander.
And then I found an interesting question at the end of the chat by Gordon Gray Stevens. I don't know whether Gordon wants to unmute, but if not, I can read it out. So he says it
yeah,
takes...
I can.
Go ahead. Yep.
You've just frozen on me, so maybe I've frozen on you as well. Yeah.
We can hear you, and something's happening with the video. Can you still hear us? Well, if not, I'll read it. There's your video. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mark. Yeah, it's really about the culture of what we're doing here. So it's really interesting to see what you've pulled together here. But there's a bit, we live in a country, Britain as a whole, where forestry relies very heavily on planting as its main tool for establishing trees, whether that's for restocking commercial sites or for biodiversity aims. We're really heavily influenced by the planting enthusiasm of the 20th century. Other more developed forestry countries in Europe are far more inclined to rely on natural processes, whether it's for biodiversity or productive forestry. Do you think, therefore, that we're doing the right thing by trying to respond to what might be a slightly out of sync culture, rather than trying to change that culture as policymakers?
Do you want to go first, Rachel?
You go for it.
It's a really, really interesting perspective, isn't it, Gordon? Because you're right, we're just used to tree planting. That has become the main mode of doing things. Does it reflect the large division in the forestry sector between larger scale schemes and woodland creation projects and all the small, tiny little woodland creation projects? Because for one or the other, allowing natural regeneration, natural colonisation might represent a different balance of risks and benefits. So I'm not sure how fragmented other countries' forestry sectors are. Ours does have that unique sort of character of having few very large owners and schemes and many, many much smaller things. So people are always wanting to spread the sort of risks around what they're going to get at the end, whichever approach they're using. But I think it's brilliant that that natural colonisation is now integrated into language, guidance, science, and the grant offers, because it is starting a conversation, and it's starting a conversation perhaps particularly when you're including the hybrid approaches that moves things away from the sort of polarisation around rewilding, which has emerged as so important as an influence on not tree planting and what not tree planting means. So I suppose the other positive thing that came through from the data, again, looking at this word regeneration, the fact that we've got a regenerative agricultural conversation that's starting, that's also quite positive by and large, and that's sort of helping people reassess whether or not tree planting is the one and only way of getting trees in the ground, and whether there might be benefits from natural processes.
Anything you want to add, Rachel?
No, I was also gonna mention how I think it resonates with regenerative agriculture, and also there being more of a conversation around agroforestry and sort of, instead of having forestry and agriculture in such silos, trying to make it more of a holistic land management approach.
Great.
Thank you.
Well, looking at the time and the fact that we don't have any other hands up, I very much want to thank Rachel and Bianca for their excellent presentations. It's been great to have 40 minutes of the social science component being summarized like this. In previous meetings, there's always been sort of 15 or 20 minutes, or it's been very early results, but there's a lot of rich insight that's come from this project, and you did a very great job in also complementing that with the other research that you've been doing. So this is a great resource. I'm pleased that there were over 80 people in the call for the webinar presentation component, and obviously the video will go online as well, so maybe more people get the chance to see it. So thanks a lot for that. We have one more TreePlanet webinar coming up, and that's our final webinar of the project, where we bring together the social science and the ecological work with a bit of a panel discussions with some land managers and policy makers. And that will be on the 20th of January. So that's maybe one to note in your diary. It will be lunchtime again, just like this one, but it will go on for half an hour longer because we have more content to present, and we have that panel discussion at the end of it. I will also just copy our TreePlanet project website in the chat in case people have missed it so far. But we are coming to the end of our project. That means that we're frantically trying to pull together all kinds of final outputs, ranging from academic papers that are being prepared, but we've also put a lot of effort into reaching out to practitioner and policy audiences. So you've seen some of our effort in the slides today. We created various illustrations to show what natural colonization or natural regeneration and hybrid approaches look like. We've been writing blogs throughout the project, but also holding these webinars, and there's sort of links to these webinars on our website, on our YouTube channel. But we're also finishing off a set of FAQs, so frequently asked questions on creating woodlands through natural colonization and using mixed methods. And the Woodland Trust is finalizing those right now, but they'll be formatted nicely and available on our website and shared in other ways. I think there's about 20 different FAQs that we're trying to answer in that document. We're also providing some guidance on how to monitor natural colonization, so what to look out for, how to set up a monitoring scheme in a practical, relatively easy way, not for academic purposes, but for understanding how your woodland is developing and how you can then use different management techniques to steer it in the direction that you want it to go. And insights from our projects have fed into the development of training events with the Woodland Trust. They're organizing 2 further training events in the new year, but also including sort of the insights from this project in more general training activities. So we're working on a couple of articles for sort of professional magazines, for the Institute for Chartered Foresters TreeS magazine, for the Woodland Trust Broadleaf supporter magazine, and we're also talking about sort of a short policy summary that we can share with various policy stakeholders that we've been working with. So hopefully a lot of useful things coming out in the next couple of months. Thank you all for your attention. Thanks again to the speakers, and hope to see many of you at our final webinar in the new year. And of course, also have a great restful winter's break. Goodbye.